1,000 generations. The covenant he made with Abraham, the oath he swore to Isaac. He confirmed it to Jacob as a decree, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. To you I will give the land of Canaan, as the portion you will inherit.
I'm always amazed when I'm in Israel. Wherever I walk, I'm surrounded by the voices of history. Every meter of ground has some historic significance. Here, I'm standing on a place where in the 6th to 8th centuries before Christ, the kings of Judea had their palaces. We're overlooking the modern and ancient road from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. Jerusalem that way with its Temple Mount, and Bethlehem to the south. It was along this road that Jacob traveled. He was the grandson of Abraham, he and his wife Rachel. And as they approached Ephrat, or Bethlehem as it is known today, she gave birth to her second son. His name was Benjamin. She had wanted to call him Benoni, which meant the son of my sorrow. She was dying even as she gave birth, but Jacob said, no, we'll call him Benjamin, which means the son of my right hand. So Rachel died on the road to Bethlehem. This road behind me, just a little ways to the south. Jacob placed up a pillar over her grave, and the scripture says in Genesis 35 that the pillar is there to this very day. In fact, it is there to this day in the 21st century. One more milestone in the journey of the people of Israel.
Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob. His story has fascinated the world for thousands of years. The son of Israel, betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, he is taken to Egypt, where he eventually rises from the depths of prison to become ruler under Pharaoh. Famine in the land of Canaan eventually forces Jacob and his sons to move to Egypt, where Joseph can take care of them. The Bible then enters a period of silence for 400 years. Exodus wakens to find the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob, now forced into slavery by a ruler in Egypt who did not know the history of Joseph and the Israelites. The first chapter of the book of Exodus ends with the horrific order of Pharaoh to throw every baby boy into the river Nile. On the banks of the Nile, a Hebrew woman places her son in a papyrus basket in a desperate attempt to spare his life. Moses is found by the Pharaoh's daughter and taken to be raised as her own. Moses was born as a Hebrew, but raised as a prince of Egypt. As God had been with Joseph some 400 years earlier, now he would be with Moses. Then Pharaoh's daughter went to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered, and the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. Raised as a prince of Egypt's royal household, Moses learned the ways of the Egyptians, but he remained a Hebrew at heart. One fateful day, he found an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew slave. Moses intervened, and in an impulsive act, killed the Egyptian. Fleeing for his life, Moses spends 40 years in Midian, where he married his wife Zipporah, and he would learn the ways of a desert shepherd and nomad. But he would do so under the watchful eye of the God of all creation, and of Israel. When time had passed, God acted again. A bush burned in the wilderness, but surprisingly it was not destroyed by the flames. Moses was curious about this strange phenomenon and turned aside to see it. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "Here I am." "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites." God had heard the cries of his chosen ones as they labored in the slime pits of Egypt, and Moses' appointed time had come for them to be delivered out of bondage. Moses would be the instrument of that deliverance, but not before the 10 plagues had humbled Pharaoh's heart and forced him to respond to Moses' demand. "Thus says the Lord of Israel, let my people go." The 10th and final plague was the most costly of all for the Egyptians, for it claimed the firstborn of all living things, including the firstborn of Pharaoh. Only those Hebrews who obediently applied lamb's blood to the doorways of their homes escaped the horrors of that dark night when death stalked the streets of Egypt. From that night on, it would be called the Passover. And each year, as Israel remembered their exodus from Egypt, children would ask, "Why is this night so special?" Parents would answer by reciting the story of the miraculous deliverance from bondage in Egypt, and one generation would tell another. They would tell of nights and days of God's miracles and provision. But if they were to tell the whole story, they would also speak of Israel's disobedience and rebellion, and of the 40 lost years of wilderness wandering.
We've called this series Israel, A Journey Through Time. And time was what it took for the children of Israel to come from Egypt to this, the Holy Land. And surely they passed through this way, a place that is called the Wilderness of Sin. A river runs through this valley, and this would have provided nourishment for the thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that were part of that generation of Israel that came here initially to settle the land more than 3,000 years ago. And Israel lives on here in the desert and elsewhere along this Mediterranean coast. People of God, people in covenant with their God, a peculiar people God called a nation.
Moses had led the people of Israel out of Egypt and into the desert. Here they would have to trust God. It wasn't long before the Israelites began to complain, yet each time Moses cried out to the Lord, and each time the Lord responded with a miracle. During this time in the desert, God gave Moses and the people of Israel the 10 Commandments and had them build the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle.
I feel like I've just stepped back into history, more than 3,000 years back in time, into the tabernacle of Moses and its linen enclosure here deep in the desert in the wilderness of Paran. When God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt, he said to them, "Build me a tabernacle that I may dwell among you." And here in this sacred setting, the tabernacle of Moses, deep in the desert, around us the mountains of the wilderness. God gave specific instructions recorded in the book of Exodus of the linen enclosure that should surround the tabernacle, with the tribes all around in their specific positions relative to the tabernacle, and then the coverings of badger skins, goat hair, and then the high priest once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, he alone entering the most holy place, sprinkling blood before the mercy seat at the Ark of the Covenant, making atonement for the sins of the children of Israel, keeping the relationship with God righteous through the sacrifice of animals as God required. Here Israel communed with their God, and here the God of Israel was at the very center of his people as they moved from place to place through the wilderness, moving from Egypt, the place of bondage, toward the promised land, the place flowing with milk and honey.
Moses would live long enough to see the promised land, but he would never enter it. The conquest of Canaan would fall to Joshua, Moses' chosen successor. It would be under his leadership that the army of Israel would subdue the Canaanite tribes and claim the land as their God-given inheritance.
God spoke to Moses. He told him he'd been chosen to lead the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt to a promised land that he would show them. They left Egypt and they crossed the wilderness of Sinai. They came eventually, after days, to the wilderness of Paran. This is the wilderness of Paran. They camped on the border of what was the land of Canaan. And from there, Moses sent 12 spies, a leader from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, 12 chosen men who would go through the length and breadth of the land of Canaan and spy it out and bring back a report. So the men went north through the wilderness of Zin. They went east toward Hebron and the valley of Eshcol. Eshcol means cluster, and they brought back the grapes on a cluster, on a stave between two men. They said, "Truly it is as the Lord has said." Joshua and Caleb, two of those leaders, were ready to go in and possess the land. They were men of great faith. But the other 10 spies brought a negative report. They said, "Yes, the land is as God has said, but there are giants in the land and there are fortified cities. We'll not be able to overcome them. We are in their sight as grasshoppers. They are giants compared to who we are." It's amazing, isn't it, that these men who had seen God open the waters of the Red Sea, provide manna from heaven, bread of heaven to feed this. Imagine, how could a multitude the size of the multitude that left Egypt be sustained in this barren wilderness place? But God sustained them by providing miracles, water that bubbled up from the desert floor, bread that fell from heaven, quail, little birds that blew in from the Mediterranean Sea, and God kept his word and fed them. But time after time, the people murmured and questioned God. They came to the border of what became Israel. And because they rebelled against God, they were turned back into the desert for more than 40 years. And God kept them there until that first generation, all those aged 20 and older, had died in the wilderness. And then he brought the new generation into the land of Israel.
After 40 years of wandering in the desert, the Israelites were finally ready to take the promised land. Under the leadership of Joshua, Jericho was the first to fall. The 12 tribes of Israel eventually took the land God promised and divided it among the tribes. In time, kings would be appointed to rule the people, but not before there was a prolonged interlude when judges held sway. Violent times when sin and rebellion were all too prevalent among Jacob's descendants, and when they eagerly embraced the idolatrous ways of the Canaanites. Even so, God found those who would speak and act for him. Men like Gideon, Samson, and women like Deborah. It is toward the end of this dark period in the unfolding drama of Israel that a young Gentile woman from Moab named Ruth enters the history of God's chosen people. Having married the son of a widow from Bethlehem named Naomi, Ruth suddenly finds herself widowed as well. It is then that she makes